Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this NQA webinar, one of a series that we have been delivering on the subject of your transition to the ISO 9001 2015 standard. My name is Margaret Rooney. I'm a regional assessor with NQA, and I'll be sharing with you our thoughts on in particular today, process approach and risk-based thinking, but also to some extent our experience to date. And among other things, we'll talk about some of the common queries and questions that people have been raising in relation to the new standard and in relation to the transition process itself. So there'll be, for some of you, I think it'll be a refresh and a reminder. Those of you that have listened to these webinars before, there'll probably be some areas of this presentation you're already familiar with, but there will also perhaps be areas that are relatively new to you. And those of you that are listening for the first time, you're very welcome, and I hope you'll all find this helpful. This broadcast is being recorded, so you will have the opportunity to listen to it again. And if you have colleagues who have not had the opportunity to listen in this afternoon, they too will have the opportunity to listen to this. You will also receive a copy of this presentation after today. I'd like to draw your attention to the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions or comments during this presentation, please type them in, because there will be time at the end of this for us to take some questions. Anything that I feel unable to answer immediately, we're very happy to follow that up with you. So, preparing for your transition, and in particular, the process approach and risk-based thinking. Our objectives this afternoon: we'll do a brief update on transition, we'll describe a process, we'll consider the interactions between processes, we'll think about risk, and understand risk analysis to manage a process. And we'll address near the end some common concerns and questions that people have been raising with us over the last few months. Now, just to remind you that all ISO 9001-2008 certificates will expire on the 14th of September 2018. And I suspect quite a few of you listening in have certificates which actually expire on that date. The transition from the 2008 version to the 2015 version will be accomplished during a single transition visit. And a new certificate to the 2015 version will be issued when you've fully met the requirements of the new standard. So September 2018 seemed a long way away a little while ago, but I think we're all becoming conscious now that it will race up upon us, and in the next 12 months and more, we expect to be quite busy supporting our organizations through their transition. So, as I'm sure you're all well aware, the 2015 standard places explicit emphasis on process and risk. And this presentation is to help you focus and understand these. Understanding process and risk, it's not something that we're going to achieve overnight. We shall all learn and understand more as we become increasingly used to the new expectations associated with the standard. And this for me has been one of the big lessons, and I think the more our clients look at the new standard, we can see that we're all on a journey. So let's look at the process approach. What does this really mean? A very simple process has inputs or requirements. It has an operation. What is it that actually needs to be done? And there is an output or a result. So that's the most basic way of thinking about a process. So the inputs could be a drawing or some work instructions, some information that you need to then start the operation. The operation is what needs to be done. You carry out an instruction. So if the input has been a work instruction, you carry out that instruction. And the output could be your final product or an interim stage of that product. But whatever your output is, this is the value add that you get from your process. Let's think of a very simple process that I think we all understand, making a cup of tea. So our inputs would be water, tea, milk, and sugar. What is it we actually need to do to arrive at this cup of tea? Well, the operation will include things like boiling the water, putting the tea in the pot, adding the boiling water to the pot, allowing it to brew, putting milk in a cup, add the tea, add the sugar, stir, and you have your output, which is a lovely cup of tea. And that's the value that has been added to all of those inputs that you have. So you enjoy drinking that cup of tea. So in summary, a process is an activity. It has an input and an output. It is transformation. You take your inputs and you transform them into an output, and that output has added value. So in clause 4.4, for example, in the 2015 standard, there are specific requirements considered essential for the process approach. So that clause actually talks about inputs and outputs, sequence and interaction. You need to determine the resources needed. You need to address risks and opportunities. This is explicitly stated in clause 4.4. And you need to evaluate and implement any changes that might be needed to your process. So let's go back to our cup of tea, a very simple process, and apply these clause 4.4 elements to it. Inputs and outputs. Well, as we saw earlier, we have our inputs, tea, milk, etc., and the outputs. In this case, the output is a drink, a cup of tea. Sequence and interaction of the processes. For example, we put the tea in the pot while the water is boiling. So there are various activities going on within that process. We determine the resources needed. We need a pot, we need a kettle, we need energy to boil the kettle, we need water, we need milk and sugar. So those are the resources that this process requires. We need to think about addressing risks and opportunities. Now, this may seem a bit over the top for a cup of tea, but again, sticking with the very simple example, check that there is actually some tea in the cupboard. Is the milk fresh? What do I do in a power cut? So these are all potential problems that might be there, and we may or may not need to be thinking about them when we come to make that cup of tea. We need to think about evaluating and implementing any changes needed. For example, perhaps your auntie states a preference for her tea being a bit stronger, and she does not like the taste of the brand that you're using. So That's some feedback or evaluation of your process that you're receiving, and you need to think, oh, next time I make Auntie a cup of tea, I may need to do some things slightly differently. So I hope that very, very simple, very basic example helps. So we have our simple process approach. We have starting from our requirements, which become our inputs, our operations, our outputs, which become our products and services. And overlaid on that, we have our risks. So this is where the risk-based thinking begins to come in. There are different categories of processes, and you're actually already very familiar with these, as I hope you'll see. We have what we call our management-oriented business processes, the MOPS. We have our COPS, customer-oriented processes. These are the core processes that directly impact on the customer. And we have our support-oriented processes, or SOPs. So what are these typically? The customer-oriented processes are things like sales, contract review, design, manufacturing, picking and packing, dispatch, handling of complaints, the things that directly impact the customer, the core processes. What is it the customer is actually paying us to do that directly affects them? And those are all terms and activities that you're already very familiar with. Then if we look at our support processes, again, I would suggest you're all very familiar with these. We have our document control processes, training, purchasing, planning, calibration and maintenance, use of IT, our corrective action processes. These are all support processes that already exist within your management system. And then finally, we have our management processes. And again, I'm sure you'll be very familiar with our old friends, management review, internal audit, and customer feedback management. So that's the three groups of processes. And let's look at some generic work-based examples. And again, just to remind you that we will have time for questions and comments at the end, so do use the chat box to submit any questions that you might have. So let's look at a generic process such as purchasing. And the inputs, what is it that might prompt us to need to make a purchase? Well, perhaps we've received a particular customer order that requires certain products that we now need to buy in. Or perhaps we maintain some stock of requirements for our customers, and that stock's beginning to run low, so that stock level would become an input to this process. So the operation that we carry out is that we generate a purchase order, and it might be for products or an outsourced process that we need to buy in. And the output of this particular process, and bear in mind, outputs can be an interim product for the next process. The output in this particular case is an authorized purchase order. What might be the measures of the success of this process? Well, in fact, do we get effective on-time delivery of the purchased product? Have we been able to move this process sufficiently quickly and effectively to actually have the product received on time? So what are the risks that there might be around this? Or if you don't like the word risk or feel that the word risk might alarm your colleagues or those that you might be internally auditing, think about it as what might go wrong. And what might go wrong is that stock might run out before we get this purchase process completed. The customer that we're actually making the purchase for might change his or her mind, or might have made an error in what it is that they actually need. Or it could be our supplier cannot respond in sufficient time. Now, I'm sure you'll all recognize these sorts of things because we've all been subject to these types of problems in one way or another, I'm sure. So the next step is purchasing our customer's order. So we've now got our purchased product, and we're going to use that purchased product to process what it is that our customer needs. So the input is the purchased product and the associated paperwork. For example, it might be necessary to have certificates of conformity as part of the input to what our customer needs. So that would be perhaps the input. The operations that we need to carry out, well, we need to check that what's been delivered is correct. We may need to update our stock records. We now need to process our customer order. And there'll be various steps involved in that, no doubt. And then we check our final product. So the output is that final product which we deliver to the customer. So the output is the product delivered to the customer along with perhaps a delivery advice note and an invoice. So those are the outputs. What do we need to measure? Well, I would suggest the process has been effective and we deliver this item on time to the customer. And we might add, we deliver the right thing on time to the customer. So that's the measure. What might go wrong? Well, perhaps we were sent the wrong thing by our supplier. Perhaps the certificate of conformity is missing. Perhaps we've made an error in carrying out our own operations. Perhaps we've been guilty of poor work scheduling. So those are all things that might go wrong. And within your management system, you need to be thinking, how do we address this? How do we prevent these things going wrong? And the truth is that's what your management system has always been about. And that's no doubt what you're doing right now. So again, just another way of looking at our processes and our process interactions. We have looking over on the left of this slide, we have our customer requirements, and on the right, we have the outputs. So running across the middle of the slide, we have our COPS, our core processes that we need to deliver to the customer. And then at the top of the slide, we have our business processes, and underneath we have our support processes. So we have things like the support of organizational knowledge or documented information, looking at the business processes. We have the setting of objectives. We have internal audit, management reviews. So the business processes are management processes. So just another way of illustrating those three main types of processes that we have in our management system. And then don't forget, we overlay that with an awareness of our risks. And what we have highlighted there is clause 6.1 within the standard, which is about identifying our risks and opportunities, which leads us nicely into our risk-based thinking. So looking at clause 4.4, the quality system and its processes, we see within this, for example, the very explicit reference to processes and the interactions of those processes. This is what we touched on earlier when we were talking about the cup of tea. And we need to know our inputs and our outputs expected from that sequence and interaction. But very importantly, what is also flagged up in this requirement for our processes is we need to address the risks and opportunities as determined in accordance with the requirements of clause 6.1. And what is this clause 6.1 in the standard? It's actions to address risks and opportunities. So we have here the standard making this link between processes and what we require of a process, and part of the requirements is addressing the risks and opportunities related to those processes. So just to reiterate, the standard in places links process and risk, and it's quite explicit in this here in 4.4.1F, and within that it cross-references clause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. However, although the standard, the 2015 standard, does explicitly reference risk in a number of places, the concept of risk is also captured in other phrases. And there are phrases such as is appropriate to, context, strategic direction. When we look at what is appropriate, we're actually saying what is necessary. In other words, what is the risk? A common phrase I think that we're familiar with, potential impact on the conformity of product. Potential impact on conformity. It's another way of saying risk. What is the risk to the conformity of the product? Objectives shall be relevant to conformity of products. Again, we're looking at risk. What do we really need to ensure conformity of our product? Potential consequences of failure, a very definite statement of risk, or the theme of risk, potential consequence of failure. And again, where we find terms such as to ensure there is no adverse impact on conformity to requirements, all different ways of expressing risk. And I would suggest before the 2015 standard, those are terms and concepts that you were already very familiar with. And I think this is nicely captured in this table. This is not my table, I hasten to add. It was actually put together by a colleague of mine. But what we have here on the left-hand side, you can see some various references to some 2015 clause references there. And on the right-hand side, if you look at the top row on the right-hand side, you will see some vocabulary related to risk. We've got the term risk itself, but we've got other vocabulary like complex, impact, effect, likelihood, consequence. These are all terms related to risk. So risk references in effect pervade the standard and always did. Just another way of looking at our processes. A number of you are probably familiar with the process turtle. You don't have to use this, but some of you perhaps do already use it and may find it useful. So again, across the middle of the slide, we have our inputs, our processes, and our outputs. And then we look at the supporting processes and inputs that we need. So to deliver our outputs, we need resources and other support activities. So in order to operate our processes and deliver our outputs, we need to look at the resources. With what? Looking at the top left-hand corner there, with what are we going to do that? with whom on the right-hand side. Looking at the lower half of the slide, we have how are we going to do this. Then we have our support processes, and then on the bottom right-hand side, what results and how are we going to analyze those results. And within that, we have indicated the clause titles. So again, don't try and study this in detail. You will have an opportunity to study the slides that you wish to in more detail when you receive a copy of this presentation. And again, don't forget our identification of risk at each of those particular points in the turtle diagram. So thinking about risk, let's look at some high-level examples. So if you're the managing director of an organization, you're probably thinking very hard about Brexit. I was with an organization just this week, and virtually everything, they are very much reliant on regulation, and all the regulations that they're working against are European. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of uncertainty there about what's going to happen to how they work in the future. Competition is a very obvious risk that we are all aware of. So we need to be aware of those risks. Changing technologies, making sure we don't get left behind because we're not keeping up to date and using new technologies perhaps. We may have a limited supplier base, and that's going to pose a risk. And we may have a limited customer base, and that's another risk. So the leadership of an organization, these are the areas of risk that they're going to be concerned with. And then there's the operational level. Let's look at some possible operational risks and examples of how we mitigate those. So if you're a warehouse, for example, you'll be very familiar with picking errors. So how do we mitigate that? Well, we perhaps get a peer, a colleague, to check what we've done and sign off our work. So that's building in a check to reduce an error. Lack of understanding or carelessness is another risk at the operational level. And managers will address or mitigate that perhaps through things like toolbox talks or team briefs. Loss of data is another risk, and organizations will invariably do some sort of backup. So perhaps a daily backup of data off-site would be one way of reducing that risk. And going back to the earlier example, there may be errors in the orders that we've received. So how do we mitigate that? Well, if you have a web ordering system or direct customer input to an order, then you're putting the onus on the customer to get it right. So that, use of web ordering is certainly one way of reducing the errors or misunderstandings that might creep in when you're taking orders from customers. Communication errors or misunderstandings, confirmation emails, writing it down and feeding it back to your customer would be recognizing a risk and building in a process to reduce that risk. Equipment failure is another obvious risk, and we often mitigate that by having some standby equipment or backup equipment that's readily available. So looking then at process risk, errors tend to occur where one process interacts with another. It's a bit like a relay race. Problems occur at the interaction or the baton changeover. The process approach is about effectiveness, not compliance. And I think this is an important thing in the 2015 standard. Perhaps historically, we've paid close attention to the procedure. Is the procedure being followed? Is it being followed correctly? But we need to think increasingly about our effectiveness. So you may be following the correct procedure or following this procedure correctly, but is it delivering the best results? What do you need to measure to know whether you're getting the best results? I would suggest you need to be measuring those elements of the process that you cannot afford to have go wrong, your significant risks. What do we really need to get right, and how do we know we're getting it right? How do we measure that? So we need to understand our process. We need to recognize the risks within that process. We need to prioritize the risks, and we need to set appropriate objectives. And I think this is important, and I hope helpful, that when you're thinking about your objectives, are they appropriate for the risks, the significant risks that you have? Will they help you with your risks? So you need to take mitigating action to reduce your risk and achieve your objectives, and measure and evaluate your performance. So I would suggest that what might go wrong, or what is a risk, should drive objectives. Objectives drive what we need to measure. So we need to ask ourselves, are the quality objectives appropriate for our risks and context? So you begin to see we're pulling together a few themes of the 2015 standard here. Pause for thought. I know there's a lot to take on board. I recently spotted this on an organisation's notice board. Customers hate risks. Quality starts by knowing the risks. And I know that whoever put that together wasn't even thinking of the 2015 standard, but I think it is a very important message that we all need to take on board. Preparing for transition. Among other things, organisations quite rightly have been concerned about context, interested parties, risks and opportunities. And a number of you have found using a PESTLE or a SWOT analysis a useful tool to do that. So it'll help you with your internal and external issues. It could help you with your risks and opportunities associated with those issues. It'll help you identify your interested parties. However, do be clear what your risks are and how they are addressed. So we need to be careful. We've done a SWOT. Now what do we do with the information that has come out of that SWOT, for example? So what exactly are our risks and how are we going to address them? Little hint here. You need to address the effectiveness, and this is in quotations because it is lifted directly from the standard. You need to address the effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities in your management review. So I suggest you carefully study the management review requirements in clause 9.3, because management review does need to be available as documented information. And that means, for example, effectiveness of actions taken to address risks and opportunities. There needs to be documented evidence that you have done that. And if you've done that, then you must know what your risks are, and they would be recorded in your management review. So, as I say, study that clause 9.3 carefully and think carefully about your 2015 management review and what information you will need to be pulling together for that. And I'd just like to, we're near the end now, some common queries that we have been receiving. These are by no means all of them, but just a few that seem to crop up quite often when I'm in discussion with people or when I'm actually doing an audit with clients who are thinking ahead to the 2015 standard. Can I keep my manual and procedures? Yes, of course you can. They've served you very well and they'll continue to serve you well. And many people have said to me, I know that in a lot of areas we don't need documented information anymore, but I find it helpful to still have it, and that's great. Do I need a risk register? The short answer is no, you don't. But you do need to know what your risks are. So there's no requirement in the standard to have a risk register, but there is a requirement to be aware of your risks. For many organizations, a risk register is a tool that they find helpful, but it's by no means a requirement. Do I need to document context? No, you don't. There's no explicit requirement in the standard to do that. However, organizations do find it useful to do so. And indeed, and I often find this in my audits, when I look perhaps at the introductory section of a quality manual or some background information to an organization on its website or in its annual report, they in effect amount to a statement of context or the elements of a statement of context. So think about what you've already got before you start worrying about what you do and do not need to document. Think about what you've already got. That will help you in this respect. Here's a tricky one. Where do I draw the line on risks? How do I know I've identified all my risks? My view is you don't. You're never sure that you have identified all your risks. You can have a really good go at this, but you know, your system is fluid. Things change and new risks may emerge or new risks will be identified. And once you've done that, then you make a note of them and act on them. But nobody's expecting that everything in your system is fully complete. It's a fluid system, it's a living system, and it's always going to be developing and changing. And again, how do I know if my interested parties list is complete? Well, you probably don't, but through your SWOT or PESTLE or Brainstorm or whatever tool you've chosen to use, you do the best you can. But again, your system is fluid, so it's very likely that perhaps you'll decide certain interested parties are no longer interested parties, but other interested parties you hadn't thought of now need to be taken into account. And finally, don't panic. Read the standard carefully. I think we all need to go back to the standard now and again and just have a close read of it, just to refresh our memories and just be clear what is specifically required and what perhaps we have been assuming is required, but in fact, if you look at the standard closely, that's perhaps not actually the case. Note carefully where you need documented information. The standard is quite specific in a number of places where you need documented information, so do be clear on that. Remember, you must transition by September 2018. And we'd like to think that in 12 months' time, most of our clients will have been through the transition process. So I think 2018 is going to be a busy year. And very importantly, used properly, the 2015 standard is there to support your business, not make unnecessary demands on you. If you're doing something and you feel it's a burden because the standard says you have to do it, you're doing something wrong. Whatever you do to meet the 2015 standard should also be helping you in your business. And if you're unsure about that, do have a conversation with your assessor about that. That's all that I have planned to say this afternoon. I believe we do have some questions which I can now start to address. I have a question here. Can you give some examples of incorporating risk from a paragraph in the standard? Is there specific wording or actions that should be used? If I understand the question properly, there's the very explicit requirement in clause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. But the standard doesn't tell you how to address your risk. The specifics, the nuts and bolts of what your risks are and how you identify them, that is really down to you. What the standard is saying, that you need to be thinking about your risks and opportunities. You need to identify them in some way. Do come back if you feel that that's not addressed. Sorry, I've just trying to read the questions here. I have another question here. Do you have a template of the regular layout of a documented business risk register? And should this include external, internal, and also interested parties? The short answer is no, I don't believe we have a template for a risk register. The risk register should be what your business needs and what you feel is appropriate. We as a certification body can make suggestions as to what might be helpful. I think we have to be careful. If we were to issue you with a template, that's a suggestion that we're telling you this is the template to use and this is what we expect to see. But no, I don't believe we have, but if you feel you need some further help or guidance on that, do come back to us and we can certainly see if there's anything around that would be helpful to you. Next question. Any tips on how you engage senior management in more risk-based approach? Well, presumably with your transition, your move to the 2015 standard, your senior management are aware of the need to transition, and this would be a good hook to point out that the standard is more explicit on risk. I think perhaps remembering the risk-based references throughout the standard, thinking of that matrix that I showed earlier, perhaps engage your senior management with the risks that you already know about and your management system is addressing. And then you can start perhaps to unpick, are there any other risks that perhaps we could make a little bit more explicit? So I think start with what you already know and what you are already managing well, and then perhaps move on to risks you're aware of that perhaps are not being managed as well as they might, and then you can engage senior management on how those might be addressed. I hope that's helpful. I have another comment here. The new version expects referring to sources of inputs. Could you explain what is the expectation related to that? What is the added requirement about it? Well, the inputs are just that. What is it that you input to your process? You're already effectively managing processes, I would suggest. So have a think about what are the inputs to that. So do you need certain information? Do you need certain raw materials? Those would be inputs to a particular process. Can't think how to be any more helpful than that. But think about what you're already doing and what information or materials you need to literally start your process. Next question, what are the criteria for differentiating between management-oriented processes and support-oriented processes? Well, I would suggest that the three groups that we have suggested should help you here. The support processes are, you know, what are the things that we need to effectively carry out our process? So it'll be things like you need trained people, you need calibrated equipment, you need properly maintained equipment, you need good documented information, perhaps. Those are all the support processes. The management-oriented processes would be at the higher level. That's the management review, the strategy development, internal audits. That's, you know, moving further up and taking a wider view of how the management system is performing. But I would suggest that the way in which we fitted them in those three main categories should be a reasonable guide for you. This is similar, I think, to a question I've already had. Can you give some examples of incorporating risk from a paragraph in the standard? The clause 4.4 and clauses 6.1 refer to risk. Do you have to renumber your QMS to match the standard, or can you use your existing QMS and expand sections to cover the new criteria? It's your system. You document it in whatever way is useful to you. And you don't have to number your QMS to match the standard, and you never did need to number your QMS to match the standard. A lot of organizations have found it useful to do so, helpful to do so, but it's not a requirement. So certainly use your existing QMS and expand it as you need for 2015, but number it in whatever way is helpful to you. Ooh, interesting one here. Can you give an example of risk in exporting processes? I assume you're meaning exporting product to overseas. The first risk I would think of there would be if you're exporting a product, there tend to be a lot of documentation requirements, and making sure A, that you've got all the relevant documents, and B, that they are complete and correct. I would suggest those are probably two potential risks that your processes and your checking mechanisms would need to take account of. I hope I've understood the question correctly, and I hope that that helps you. I'm sure there are lots of other things in the exporting process that could also be potential risks. Could you give an example of leadership and how to measure it in clause 5? Well, who is the most senior person with accountability for your management system? Is it clear who that person is? And what is their attitude to the system? And interestingly, I was with an organization just this week, and it was very clear at the closing meeting that the particular manager, whom I hadn't actually met during the course of the audit, was extremely committed to the 2015 standard and very anxious that the organization get moving with it. So that's an obvious indicator. I wouldn't say a measure, an indicator. Yeah, it's really how committed is your management to the system. So you can get it from conversations, communications, general understanding, and commitment to the requirements of the standard. Another question. How integrated would you expect a 9001 and 27001 system to be? For example, would you expect a joint risk identification approach? The ISO 27001 is the information security standard. I find that a difficult one. I don't audit against 27001 myself, but where I have seen that in use, it fits the 9001 model extremely well. So I believe 27001 has some quite specific requirements around risk. So obviously you would address those. Now, if there are aspects of your system that fall outside of 27001, you still need to be aware of those risks. It would be very helpful probably to you to integrate the two into a common approach. But I would suggest it's not absolutely necessary. But if you're doing 27001, you've got probably the basis of a very good risk identification process there, and you could usefully apply it across everything else that you do. Are risks identified in a process also inputs to that process, or are they control parameters? They are indicators of controls that you might need. So yeah, you're now aware of a risk. What are you going to do about it? So it's probably more of an awareness raising thing. Can't think of anything more helpful to say than that. So I hope that answers the point. The next question, you talk about management review to show evidence. Can this just be reference to an annual document, as if it's fluid, it means changing the QMS every year? You don't need to change your QMS every year. Your QMS is going to be constantly under review, and will be, elements of it will change as needed, and that's part of what your management review will be looking at. I'm talking about the content of the review itself, whatever form that takes. Reviews can be documented minutes or a documented report. Whatever way you do your review, you need evidence of it, but it doesn't mean you have to change your QMS every year. Far from it. If I haven't answered your point, do come back to me. And I have a question here. Should we use the same approach for 14,001? Seems sensible to apply a common approach to managing environmental risks. Absolutely, yes. When you're doing if you're doing a SWOT or PESTLE or brainstorm of your risks, yeah, what are the risks that also have an implication for your environmental management? And there may be business risks that are relevant both for your 9001 needs and for your 14,001 needs. So yes, absolutely, it does make sense to approach them together. And I have one here. Would Fmea be a good way of managing process risk? I would have thought so. I don't think I've seen a PFMEA. FMEA, I understand. Certainly a good way of identifying risk. That's the first thing. It's identifying your risks and then asking yourself, prioritizing the risks. How serious is this risk? And then that should drive what you need to do about it. So I would have thought so. I have time for one more question. Will auditors be looking for more robust systems than in the past, since there are less shall requirements? Will we be looking for more robust systems? More robust, I would suggest, in the sense that we will be looking for systems that genuinely support the business, genuinely help the business. And I do think that the concept of risk and opportunities, and let's not forget risks and opportunities, that's what your system should be about. And I think our audit approach in the future will be, and is beginning to be, much more about having a dialogue with you about your context, about your risks and opportunities, about your interested parties, and how they in turn influence your objectives and influence the management system that you need. And in many ways, and I'm beginning to see and understand this better myself, in many ways, that means we don't have to worry so much about procedures, but we do need to worry about, are you achieving what you should achieve, and have you got the documented evidence of that? And as I mentioned earlier, there are lots of references in the standard to areas where you do need that documented evidence. So I think it's a different type of approach that we'll be using and much more business focused. I hope that helps. That's all we have time for today. I'd like to thank you all very much indeed for taking time out to listen to this webinar. Thank you very much indeed for some pretty challenging questions. I hope that I was able to help. I always feel a little bit on the spot in these situations, having to think on my feet. This has been recorded, so you can listen to it again, and you will receive a copy of the slides. Thank you very much indeed, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you.